Good afternoon and welcome to the HeadBox Connect panel conversation on Wednesday, the 24th of March, 2021. My name is Charlie Marr. I'm the COO of HeadBox, and we're here today to discuss a very exciting and I think very, very relevant white paper that we've recently published called Working in a Virtual World, Comparing the Impact of Virtual and In-Person Events. Now, this was published in partnership between HeadBox and San Francisco State University. And the aim of the paper was to understand the personal and professional impact of virtual events in comparison to their in-person counterparts. And today I'm joined by a fascinating panel who are going to help me unpick some of the findings from the white paper. And the aim that we have certainly for the audience today is to share as many actionable insights and recommendations as we can with you guys for running your virtual, hybrid, and in-person events throughout the remainder of 2021 and of course into 2022. So I will start with the introductions. Well, first up, we are joined by Dr. Diana Sanchez, who is an assistant professor at San Francisco State University and co-author of the white paper, and by her colleague Tamara Skootsky, who is a graduate researcher, San Francisco State University, and also one of the co-authors of the paper. So welcome, guys, and thank you so much for joining us today. We also have Alexandra O'Malley on the call, who is a director and head of events at Barclays International. Alex is responsible for overseeing the meetings and events program of the Barclays International team. That's 28 people within that team, and I think what's really interesting is that's a program that was predominantly in person in 2019, but obviously brought into the virtual world. So no doubt lots of learnings to share with us today. Jonathan Kazarian is the founder and CEO of Axel Events. Axel Events is a virtual and hybrid event platform, and they talk about creating authentic human connections and memorable experiences. And we were just chatting just before we went live. Axel Events have grown from 8 people in January last year to 90 people now. So huge growth, and I think obviously capitalizing on what's been going on and the importance of virtual events. And then finally, last but by no means least, we have Andrew Needham, who is the founder and CEO of HeadBox. Obviously, I work very closely with Andrew, and over 500 virtual and hybrid events organized by HeadBox in Q4 last year. So again, lots of learnings that Andrew will no doubt be able to share with us. So welcome, guys. Thank you very much for joining. And just before we get going, a few little bits of housekeeping for the listeners. Firstly, there is a Q&A functionality that I believe is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So please do drop any questions you've got in there. Those will come through to me in real time. I'll do my best to sort of seamlessly drop them in, but I can't promise anything. So we're also going to leave 10 minutes at the end just to do a Q&A. So we'll do our best to get to your questions. And finally, just because we do get this question fairly regularly, we can't see you and no one else can see you. So the 6 of us on the panel here are visible to everyone, but don't worry, you can sit back and relax in your kitchen or living room, wherever it is that you're dialing in from today, safe in the knowledge that no one can see you. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the white paper, I think, is a fantastic piece of work because it's really detailed in the research that it draws on and the insight it provides, but it's also got some really actionable recommendations. So I think anyone reading it is really accessible in terms of how to run your meetings and events program. And I think in terms of the structure, see Tamara, Diana, you look at the benefits of in-person interactions, you look at the benefits of virtual interactions, then the limitations of both, and then you come to some sort of recommendations, I guess moving forward. So a great place to start, I think, to frame today's conversation, and Tamara, I'm going to come to you on this one, is if you could just sort of broad stroke take us through your findings.
Sure. Well, basically, as we started to aggregate the research, we found pretty early on that there seemed to be this divide of technology being super useful, at least what we've seen of technology in the past, for producing these more productivity-oriented outcomes. Super helpful for collaboration, for efficiency, directing attention towards a task. And then in-person interactions were really preferred for a lot of interpersonal outcomes, liking somebody, just feeling like you know them. But as you mentioned, we also found that there were these cons or these caveats to those types of things. So in virtual platforms, it still takes longer to orient people to a platform. It can feel more effortful to actually share those ideas. And that's something that in-person interactions can then bring. And on the other hand, in person, we found that there are these social biases that come into play. We don't even notice that they're there, where virtual platforms can start to really make new things come out of that. So that I would say was really our key finding and some of what really drove a lot of our recommendations.
Nice. And I think it's fair to say we sort of come at this virtual conversation with the assumption that in-person is very much the norm, or at least was the norm. So I guess, Diana, looking into those virtual events, was there anything that really surprised you about the research and the findings that you guys came to?
Absolutely. When we were looking at it, we were a little bit surprised to see that some people had a preference for the virtual events. And you're absolutely right. We have seen for so long in-person events as the default, as the norm. And it's very clear that COVID-19 and all of our experience with the pandemic and a rapid shift and then a continued gradual shift towards getting comfortable using technology, learning new technologies, building the infrastructure for that, people having more comfort with that has actually opened up this new set of experiences and expectations that people have. And so what we found is that there were certain pockets of people that found these virtual events to be more comfortable in some ways, more accessible in some ways, and some very practical reasons. The time it takes to travel to an in-person event, the cost it takes to get to it or to access the event, to register for an event. But for some, it could even be a social issue of just feeling more comfortable participating in or having access to an event, that there may not be as much requirement for being prepared and being ready and being front facing with other people. And so I think that there are some instances in which this has really enabled participation. And for a lot of events, participation is key. That's really what we're trying to get at, is a larger audience to share information or get a collective sense of something. So there's a lot of value in recognizing what this virtualization has enabled in terms of how we plan events.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that was a finding that when I first read the paper, I was taken aback by, because you just assume it's going to be easier to engage when you see someone in person. But in fact, the white paper suggests that that's really not the case. So Tamara, how do you think virtual events compare with in-person when it comes to that engagement and interaction piece?
Yeah, I would say that in many ways they're just different. They might speak to different people, and they may give us different channels or different options of how to engage. And so what's really exciting right now in events is exactly that. There's this like learning possibility potential for so much innovation and so much change in how we start to use all the different options that now maybe existed before, but we weren't necessarily thinking about incorporating in the same ways.
Yeah, got it. And I think towards the end of the paper, in the recommendations that you guys make, you talk about intentional event design. So just for the people dialing in today, could you, Tamara, tell us a little bit more about what that is?
Sure, definitely. I think by intentional event design, we really mean looking at the outcomes, whatever the goals are for the event we're trying to plan, and then really being intentional about choosing the features, the modalities, the ways in which we offer to people to engage and use those features that we offer. And by doing this, we can start to really expand our range and hopefully be better able to achieve those outcomes with more people.
Got it. So Diana, does that mean that you're analyzing people's behaviors within the sort of event planning stage of an event?
Not necessarily, possibly. It depends very much on the goal of the event and what we're trying to achieve. What really is powerful here is that we now have very accessible, easy to use, and technologies that people are really comfortable with. And so what that allows is almost a choose your own adventure style, where if we can enable, and I hope we'll get time to talk about this as we enable more hybrid experiences that do allow that in-person and virtualization, we're going to see an expansion of who can be there, who can participate, and also the ways in which people will participate. And so if we have an event that is about networking, there can still be alternatives for people to network through other forms of technology that are still tied into that event, unique ways of finding people, of connecting with people, of reaching out and starting a conversation. And so I think that we're more so enabling people to find the avenues that work best for them in participating in a way that accommodates their lifestyle, their schedule, just what's going on for them that day, how they're feeling. And that's really what's going to be so powerful moving forward, is that accessibility and that flexibility of the event structure.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And I think there's a few things in there that we definitely want to come back to unpack, especially around the technology. I can see John will have a lot to add there. But before we do, let's look at, I guess, what your experiences are of virtual events, because I think it's fair to say that 2020 was the year of virtual events. I read a report by Bizabu that suggested in 2019, 97% of B2B events, which is obviously what we're talking about today, were held in person, meaning that 3% were virtual. Whereas in 2020, 90% of those events were held virtually and 10% were in person. So it was a complete role reversal, ultimately. So I know everyone on the call has experienced lots of virtual events. So, I mean, Alex, I'd love to hear from your point of view at Barclays, what's your experience of virtual events been, and how has that changed over the last sort of 12 months or so?
Gosh, we have learned so much in the last year, and how we approach virtual now has really, really developed since the beginning of the pandemic, that's for sure. So I guess going back to the beginning, like many events teams, we initially found ourselves turning out a huge volume of virtual events to stay front and center of our clients' minds. And that initial change was fast and furious, both in terms of the number of events, but also in the learning curve that the planners went on. And I say this a lot, but never miss an opportunity. While so many people were sent to do their jobs from home, event planners were sent home and at the same time had to learn a completely new job. And that is something I admire all of them for. The industry has done amazingly in that. So now, while there is still a huge volume, that has really evolved over the course of the year into a much more strategic and creative way of planning. That, of course, includes fairly what we would now say normal things like targeting global rather than local audiences, leveraging being able to host much larger audiences than we'd be able to in an in-person venue, and as well as that, understanding the benefits of replays, much like the movie screening reference in the white paper that I particularly loved. And then as well as that, we've of course had to look at completely new ways of engaging audiences and keeping them engaged. And I think it's that agility and creativity that we'll see translate into a new normal for the industry, and kind of extending the event planners toolkit going forward into hybrid and into in-person when we get there.
Got it. And Jonathan, I guess sitting the other side of the fence, being the provider of the technology for a lot of these events, how have you seen things develop in the last year?
This time last year, it was exactly what you'd imagine. It was everybody trying to figure out what a virtual event is and how to host a virtual event, what platforms actually do for them. And that conversation has completely changed. Today, it's much more intentional in the event design, and it's finding the platform that is most applicable for the goals of the event. And then taking a step back and thinking about what is the purpose of hosting these events? Is it to re-engage community? Is it to bring the audience together? Is it to drive growth for the business? And trying to identify which platform is the best fit for those objectives, for bringing that group, that audience back together. The other thing that we're seeing quite a bit now is the frequency of events picking up. So all of the burdens that would go into hosting an in-person event, the months and months in advance you'd have to plan, the months in advance people would have to book travel, that's alleviated. Yeah, it certainly takes a long time to plan a virtual event as well, but not quite as much time. And that opens the door to re-engage your community at a much higher frequency than you've ever been able to in the past.
Interesting. That's interesting. Alex, do you think that sort of relates to your planning? Do you see yourself doing a higher volume of virtual events?
We've definitely seen this year that our number of events has skyrocketed while our budgets haven't. So yeah, we've absolutely seen that already. Yeah, the individual events are definitely shorter, sharper, and much more of them.
No, that makes sense. And Andrew, how about yourself? How have you seen things change?
Well, I think there are two massive sort of impacts that I think we've seen. I think the first is just how virtual has uncovered not just a little bit of an extra audience here, but we're talking 10 times audiences that live events on their own were just not reaching, they were just not tapping into. And I think it's the scale of that audience that has been uncovered by virtual that I think has been such a massive eye-opener. So, and we've had so many examples, I think, of events that were in person only in 2019 that then became virtual only 1 year later, and they were attracting audiences that were 10 times their in-person counterpart a year before. So, and I think part of the reason for that is some of the things that Diana and Tamara have touched on is that virtual shouldn't replicate that in-person format. It is a different way of reaching people that, as you say, can accommodate their lifestyle or just where they are, and gives them that ability to engage and participate in an event, whereas perhaps before they wouldn't have been able to have done that. And I think the second biggest, eye-opener is just how virtual is going to allow all of us to contribute really seriously and significantly to delivering more sustainable event programs. And I think one of the big shifts that we're seeing is that certain event types will predominantly, if not completely, move to being virtual only, because it's going to reduce, obviously there's going to be a huge reduction in cost, but I also think just that impact on CO2 and some of the statistics you referred to in the white paper is, isn't it? It's mind-blowing what the amount of CO2 that we use, the amount of waste that we use by attending events in person. So I think that is going to have a big impact. And what does that mean for travel budgets? Because I'm hearing from our clients that travel budgets are going to be reduced. And I think some of that reduction is going to go to the bottom line. So our clients are going to save money from not having such big travel budgets. But I also think some of it is going to go into virtual, and is going into virtual just to support that point about the higher frequency. You're going to be doing more events more often, and those touch points that you're going to be able to have with staff and with clients is only going to now be increased because you have virtual alongside in person in your events armory now as part of your event strategy that just wasn't there before.
Yeah, no, got it. That makes sense. We've had a couple of questions in already, and Alex, I just want to come back to a point that you made around the volume of events going up, but budgets going down. And I'm going to come to both Alex and John, I think, for this one. The question, we've looked into virtual events and the costs seem outrageous, I'm quoting. What are some of the ways to keep the costs down? And how do we get help to get delegates back into rooms to do hybrid or in-person events when they seem so comfortable just attending events virtually? So I guess let's take that in two parts. So how do you keep the cost of the virtual events down? And then we'll come to inspiring this sort of confidence to get people back to in person. John, do you want to take that?
Yeah. So in terms of keeping the cost down, the first cost that probably comes to mind is the cost of the platforms. And when you look at the cost of the platform, a lot of the platforms are $2 to $8 per attendee per day. Frankly, that is cheaper than the cost of having coffee on site for each attendee. So from that perspective, it's quite affordable. Some of the other costs that tend to run up the bill are the production costs. And one really easy way to cut down on your production costs is to pre-record your content and either edit it yourself or work with an editor who doesn't have to be doing it live, because the costs to do that are they're a fraction. And you're ensuring the quality of the content that's going out there. And from the audience's perspective, it still feels like a live engagement. The speaker can be there fielding questions in the chat throughout the presentation. They can be there, they can jump in and answer Q&A after the fact, but you can reduce your budget on production by 70% or more taking that approach.
Got it. You've given away the game, John. They're going to know now that this is pre-recorded rather than live. Nice. And then Alex, what about, I don't know if you guys have given this much thought at Barclays, but how are you going to look to inspire that confidence to get people out of their homes and back into events?
I think there's a lot of elements to that. There's the safety, all the aspects around health and safety, which I think are kind of separate, because they will come naturally once we are doing things, I believe, in our personal lives. People will start wanting to do things once they've done a wedding, or they've done, smaller gatherings in their personal lives. They'll kind of start doing those in their professional lives as well. And I also think they'll start from the top with those really small bespoke senior meetings, and then more and more will kind of take place. So I think that will almost take care of itself, although there are lots of considerations for the planners. Our health and safety form, as Andrew and I have talked about this many times, has increased exponentially. You cannot imagine. But I think it goes back to what Diana was saying. It's about what is the purpose of your event, and what are your attendees looking to get out of it? Because some things translate perfectly to virtual and will continue to be virtual, I really do think. I think we'll come on to this in a bit, but I think some things really do only come across best in person. And I think if you're looking at your audience and what they want, and you're looking at what your purpose of your event is, then that will solve for itself.
Got it. That makes sense. So I think what I'm hearing there is we came into the pandemic, or Q1 last year, and it's a point you make, Alex, around having to learn a new job in terms of running those virtual events. I think from what John was saying, it sounds like people really know what they're doing with virtual events now. But how has the technology changed in that time frame as well? So John, I think you're probably best placed to take us through that one.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing I would add to that part of the conversation is that it's not just about thinking about that individual event. It's thinking about the entire event program throughout the course of the year, and how much of your audience or your attendee, how many days a year that you're engaging them, whether that be an in-person experience that historically might have been 2, 3, 4 days per year, but now you have that opportunity to maybe get their attention for 5 or 10 additional days per year, and thinking about that total share of their attention that you're able to capture. At the end of the day, that's really the opportunity for technology to bring that audience together. And for any sort of association, any business, any community to get in front of their audience and grab their attention, that's at the end of the day, the opportunity there. In terms of the way that technology's evolved to facilitate that, we've obviously seen a ton of maturity in the platforms over the past year. We've also seen a lot of differentiation that's come to market in the platforms in terms of the different categories that they're serving. Some being entirely focused on trade shows, some more focused on conferences, some more focused on creators. And it's about, again, finding the platform that fits that audience or fits your goals most appropriately. But in terms of the way that's going to continue to evolve, it's going to be much of introducing additional opportunities for personalization, additional opportunities for having that always on experience as part of that event program throughout the course of the year, and bringing that community together, but also providing all that insight and data to the organizers of the event so they can make that experience better. Because as everybody is trying to bring more share of attention throughout the course of the year, we as event professionals, we have to get better, and we have to create content that's truly engaging and is keeping the attention of our audience.
Yeah, that's share of attention, maybe that will become a metric that people talk about, which actually is one of the questions that have come up is around ROI. And I think measurability is obviously mentioned in the white paper as something, as a huge benefit of virtual events. How are you, Jonathan, sort of measuring the return on investment or the return on participation, however you want to sort of phrase it, for customers who are organizing virtual events?
Yeah, and again, this goes back to the type of event it is. We had a trade show on the platform the other day. It was for a tool manufacturing company, and they sold, it was just over $7 million of tools, power tools, over the course of 2 or 3 days. So that's a very obvious one, and the cost of hosting that event as compared to doing so in person is astronomical. We've also, there's one event organizer that I was chatting with the other day. Their event in person, they did 1.7 million in revenue. For in person, 1.7 million in revenue for virtual this year. But in person, their return, their profit was about $430,000. Virtually, it was over $740,000. So there's a huge difference there in terms of looking at, we don't always have full insight into all of the costs that go into it, because there's additional costs like production and some of the sponsorship revenue and aspects like that, which we don't necessarily have insight into. But from a pure cost perspective, the cost is around 10% from what we're hearing.
Got it. 10% of the cost of doing it in person.
Yeah.
Which obviously is going to translate to the bottom line.
Right. And you're not necessarily generating as much in ticket sales or revenue, but your reach is significantly greater. So the total revenue tends to be the same, if not greater.
Got it. Nice. So just moving the conversation on, looking, I guess, more to in-person events, one of the sort of benefits that you guys talk about in the white paper of virtual events, which we touched on earlier as being maybe surprising, was that it actually facilitates a better interpersonal dynamic. And you suggest that virtual environments actually create a more equitable playing field, is the phrase that you guys use. So Tamara, why do you think that is?
Well, what we find is that, in person, we have so many social cues and we can't control them. You may not know my name, but you will know what I look like. You will know how I stand. You will know how my voice sounds, how loud it is, all of these cues that even the best we can do at impression management, we can't control them all. And this gives people impressions of us. And in a virtual context, we can really use, depending on the platform, we might have an avatar, we may be able to control our name, we may be able to keep our camera off, whatever the thing is, we can have more control over what people know of us and how we interact in the ways that make us, A, feel comfortable, and B, maybe make our voices heard more. And we actually do see this in the research that, people, especially who have higher social anxiety or who come from more marginalized or minority social groups, feel more comfortable speaking when they are using a mediated technology. And they also feel better about how they express themselves and better about what they said. So it's definitely there in the research that it's helpful to people who maybe don't feel as comfortable in person to start to get their voice out.
Got it. And I think, Andrew, for example, I've seen you speak in front of hundreds of people in person, people who are physically in the room. Today, we've got a couple of hundred people dialing into this webinar. How does that compare for you? Do you feel more comfortable in this environment? Does it feel like it's just the six of us having a conversation in comparison to us being in front of 350 people in an auditorium?
Well, that doesn't happen when you're in an unless you're sort of tapping the microphone, but you'd have done that beforehand. No, I mean, I think when you're, well, for me personally, when I'm in a room speaking in front of a couple of hundred people, you definitely feed off the energy of the people in the room, and I think there is I've felt that, whether that is getting just the response to what you've said, or could be some humor, to your calling people out in the room in different ways, the way you try and bring that audience with you, and to go on that journey with you in a room when they're in front of you, I think it's much easier to do that. I find it much easier that I can be much more myself in that live environment than perhaps I can be here. I don't even know. You kind of forget you've got 200 people there that are here listening to you, because I can't see them. But I think you don't get that same. Yes, I just don't. You don't get that same feeding off that live experience as you do virtually. And I think that's for all the reasons that we've touched on. Those cues, those social, those cues that you look for, and that you can see and feel and smell, and all of those senses are activated live. Yeah.
So I guess it works both ways. It can make people feel more comfortable, but it can make people feel less comfortable as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. And those in-person interactions are something that you guys touch on in quite a lot of detail in the white paper. And you talk about in-person interactions leading to a richer experience, a wider range of sort of emotional expression and connection. You talk about connectedness and how that leads to social health. I guess, why do you think, Diana, that human interaction is so important in events? And which events do you think it's most important for?
Absolutely. Well, we have a lot of research looking at this concept of need to belong. And this is a very innate human need, that the connection with other people, the social interaction, it really explains why we value family, why we value culture, why we value community. And so when we're looking at events that really highly are supporting these similar concepts of working with people in a similar industry, we're connecting with people in doing similar business or in your same organization, where you're really emphasizing or focusing on how can we talk and connect about mutual ideas, how can we be creative and come up with new strategies, how can we be open and share, that is much more meaningful than an event that is maybe more focused on logistics, or is maybe more focused on some sort of a process oriented. So if we're looking at how do we share and connect versus how do we learn or complete or do, if I'm going and I'm wanting to experience how to learn a new topic, that might be better facilitated by me being able to tap into virtually, watch exactly what I want to watch, maybe ask a question via text and get what I need, and then continue on with my work. Whereas if I'm going to really network and connect and find people who can help me understand something or work on a new project, that is going to be so much more valuable, having those social underpinnings where we can really connect and feel that connection with other people.
Got it. So again, it comes back to the point Jonathan's made a few times. It's all about the type of event. It comes back to that intentional event design, I guess, that Tamara spoke about earlier on. Okay, nice. So there are lots of benefits of virtual events that we've touched on. There are benefits of in-person as well. So now I guess if we look at the flip side of the coin, we look at some of the challenges. Alex, I'm going to come to you first on this one. From your experience in the last 12 months, what are the main challenges you've had with organizing and delivering virtual events?
I think it actually goes to all the points that we've just been talking about. I think while we have found it fairly easy to recreate a learning or a thought leadership environment virtually, what we found much more difficult to recreate is that relationship build, as Diana was saying, between people, the connectedness and belonging, which I really liked, and I'm going to steal. Essentially attending an event, especially a really unique or special event, a shared experience, and that's what often bonds people. And it's incredibly hard when each attendee is, like we all are now, sitting separately, mostly within their own homes at the moment. It's hard to then generate that chemistry that an in-person event generates with much more relative ease, all of those reasons, with social cues. It is, though, I would say, easier to do when a group is already known to each other. For example, a team meeting or a small group of people who already know each other very well or networked regularly in person beforehand. So for those circumstances, a virtual social activity can have really great outcomes, and we have found that. But I think all in all, it is much harder to build those relationships and to recreate those virtually.
Got it. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on this area? Conscious, obviously, that you guys organised them fantastically well, but if there were challenges, what would they be?
Yeah, so probably the biggest challenge is that, let's say you're in a venue, right? You're giving a presentation, for whatever reason, the microphone's not working, you need to swap the battery. The audience is not getting up and leaving, right? Like, it's rude to walk through those doors. In a virtual setting, as soon as something starts to go wrong, it's much harder to keep your audience's attention, and it's much harder to bring them back in. So execution, flawless execution, is far more important. And that does put the onus on the event organizers to make sure that they're practicing and planning with the speakers, with everybody who's involved, and ensuring that those experiences go off without a hitch. Because again, it's harder to bring people back in when you do start to lose their attention.
Yeah, that does make sense. And those periods of time where there is a glitch, they feel like forever. You know, it could be a couple of seconds, but it feels like a lot longer than that. Whereas when you're at a conference, oh, it's fine, it's a couple of seconds, we'll finish our coffee and then it'll be back on the main stage. It's no sweat. Yeah, I can really realize that. Do you think, John, that people are doing things differently in virtual conferences and events now that they weren't doing in-person conferences before the pandemic?
Absolutely. The emphasis on creating networking experiences is far greater in the virtual world than it was in person. In the in-person world, yes, there's time for coffee in the morning and some networking there, and maybe a cocktail hour at the end of the day. And often the people who'd even travel to events are people who are comfortable in those settings. But then there's also plenty of people who are maybe traveling to a venue, staying at a hotel, and they're not comfortable walking down to that bar, not knowing anybody, and having to break the ice themselves. And fortunately, the entire dating app world has actually paved the way for technology being that icebreaker, to make it more comfortable for technology to make introductions for us. And we're seeing that through platforms, the organizers are providing these opportunities to bring the community together and break the ice for them. It's not that people aren't comfortable having a conversation with somebody they don't know. It's that they just don't know how to start that conversation. And technology can help them do that, whether it be the virtual experience or when we do have a greater return to in-person, there's just so much more opportunity to use technology to make those introductions and make that a more comfortable experience for people so they can build those lasting relationships and then come back together post-event, post-virtual event or post-in-person event through technology to rekindle those relationships in a way that, you know, if we have a once a year event in person, we might not ever see that person again, right? Maybe we connect on LinkedIn, but that's it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And Tamara and Diana, you guys touch on this, don't you? Is like the number of engagements that you have with someone in a virtual event is actually much higher than the number that you have if you're attending the same conference, for example. Could you explain a little bit more about that? Tamara?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, in a virtual space, there are, if we plan for them, so many more channels for us to connect with people. And as Jonathan's mentioning too, in virtual and in-person events, we can start to facilitate those connections, sharing with people, oh, you might find this person interesting, or even connecting more easily a friend to a friend, because we don't have to actually see them both at the same moment in the same room. And so this really begins to expand this potential reach, not just for the event organizers and the event itself, but also for each individual attending the event to actually meet more people that they want to meet, talk to more people that they want to talk to, and make those connections that are helpful and beneficial and exciting for them.
And let's keep in mind, with in-person events, you might be at a conference and for 6 hours you're listening to presentations. There is no two-way dialogue going on. In a virtual setting, you've got a chat going throughout the entire presentation, and it's a threaded chat, so you can enter into a conversation with somebody that might go on for an hour.
Yeah,
absolutely. Oh, sorry. And to add on to that, you might also have a list of people's names who've attended an event that you can send them a message afterwards and connect with them. You might say, oh, so-and-so, I saw you attended this event, whereas someone else might be sitting across a very large room. They're not going to wave you down to have a simple conversation with you. So the technology really facilitates additional connections. It really facilitates communication. And also, when we're live and in person, there's nothing else competing for the attention as much. We really are all sitting in our seats facing forward, unless it's an alternative setting. But for the most part, virtually, we have so many additional options of how to contribute, to how to participate. And people are much more comfortable, much more familiar sending a quick message that they could send a chat to the group. They could send a private message to someone. So we really are facilitating and opening up networking, connecting, and communicating by making that available.
Yeah, certainly. So one of the recommendations that you make in the white paper is essentially, where possible, combine both in-person and virtual, because that creates, and I quote, the best of both worlds. So John, coming to you first, and I'm keen to get everyone's thoughts on this one. What does a good hybrid event look like?
Yeah, so the first part of a good hybrid event, or what we believe the first part of any in-person event going forward, is going to be to think about the pre-event and post-event interactions as well, because any decision to attend an in-person event in the future is going to be a much bigger decision, both from the perspective of deciding, do I even need to go since there's a virtual offering, but also getting budgetary approval, booking my travel, taking, frankly, the safety risks that I could potentially be taking by going to that event. And if I'm going to do that, it needs to feel like an exclusive club that I'm now becoming part of. So you have to build that hype and bring that community together in advance of the event. And yeah, hybrid is often thought of as, what is the opportunity during that 2-day window for people to chime in virtually while people are on site? But so much more of that hybrid experience is not just during those 2 days. It's that opportunity to bring that community together pre-event and then re-engage them after the event. As for during the event, yeah, I mean, it's certainly being able to stream that content out to a virtual audience and letting people participate in the chat from home with those on site and chime in and ask questions. That, to me, that's not as novel of the opportunity set that we have here to build and engage that community and use events as a tool for growth for our organization.
Makes sense. And Alex, have you guys been doing much planning at Barclays on what a good hybrid event looks like?
This is a really tough question for us because we are at the very, very start of our hybrid journey, scribbling notes of what John's saying there. So we're still working out what hybrid means for our audiences. But I was having a conversation the other day and someone put hybrid in the best way I have heard it described. And that was, think of it like Glastonbury. Glastonbury is the best example of a hybrid event. It's a live event taking place alongside the streaming of the event or aspects of it. And they are two completely separate events happening with two separate audiences with very different needs and wants. And yet they take place simultaneously and both satisfy their separate audiences. And so I think bearing that in mind, how we're starting to look at hybrid is starting with the objectives of the event to see if hybrid fulfills those. And then if it does, honing in on our audiences and what they are looking to get from the experience and how we can then deliver that in the best way for them. And I think that's what it comes back to every time is getting it right for the audience, no matter how they're experiencing that event, and also creating uniqueness in all those experiences and how they want to experience that content. So yeah.
Got it. I like the idea of the Glastonbury comparison. I think is a really effective one.
I can't say we're going to be doing anything quite like that. Not quite that cool.
No one will be going to Glastonbury until at least this time next year. So, Andrew, what about your thoughts? How are you guys approaching hybrid?
Sorry, I totally agree with what Alex was saying there. That's a good example, I think. I think Glastonbury is a good example, but there are quite a few examples in our everyday life. I mean, when you talk to people who love their sport and, all the interactions that we now have around sporting events, if we can't actually be there in person, and how we use technology and how we engage with content that is very specific to us as an audience that are not there live. So I think when we actually stop and think about it, and we look around the place, there are, I think, quite a few really good examples of where hybrid is already part of our lives for things that we're passionate about. I think there were just maybe a couple of things that we've seen that actually Tamara and Diana, you touch on in the white paper, which is this idea of the kind of hub and spoke model, where you might have a slightly larger event in one place and you have sort of local hubs, you know, so a hybrid in one place, but maybe in person, taking smaller in-person events in local hubs, and the content, some of the content that you then consume and participate in, you just do it in your local hub. Some of it you're sharing with other hubs, and so I think there are some interesting sort of opportunities to play with different formats there in the future that perhaps we hadn't considered before. I think the other interesting thing was just how you bring that virtual audience into a live room, and this idea of having a moderator, I think, is a good one. And we've seen that where you've got maybe a live panel. There's a moderator there in the room, in the venue, but that person's role is to bring that virtual audience into the room. And I think there's a very good role that can be played there that we've already seen in some of the events that we've done for our clients.
And Diana, obviously, as Andrew mentioned, you guys do reference this in a fair amount of detail, drawing on a lot of academic research. So what scientifically would you guys recommend including to make a really successful hybrid event?
Yeah, I completely agree with Andrew. I think in these initial stages, we're probably wanting to have more basic needs addressed, such as how am I going to get access? How simple is that access going to be? How easy is that technology for me to use? And really key here is how familiar is that technology to me? Because I start to have expectations as I've experienced other events that these new events I go to will look a certain way. I have an expectation that I'll be able to be in a chat room, ask a question, send a message to someone, send a private message. We start to see these expectations and creating a sense of norms. And then as we're moving beyond that, just like Andrew is saying, I think we're going to see more integration over time. How do we bring the virtual and the in-person worlds together? How do we connect it to be less of a separate siloed experience and more of an integrated experience, so that people who are actually at the event are being able to connect with and have an experience that's dynamic with the people who are attending virtually. And that's what we're also seeing in the research, that people really benefit from feeling like they're actually a part of it and participating it just in the avenue that they've chosen. And so people want to be able to have the experience that they're looking for through the expectations of the technology that they have, but also to be able to connect and interact. So if I see that someone is attending an event in person, it might be harder for me to send a message to that person. How can we facilitate that? What can we do to enable those connections between the in-person and the virtual world? And I think over time, people are going to start to expect and want that as well.
Yes. Now, I'm just going to drop in a couple of questions that are coming in at this stage, because I think they're quite relevant. And we touched on this earlier briefly. And Alex, maybe for you, so this person's asking, how many events do you think will return to in person versus will stay entirely virtual?
I mean, it's hard to, and we talked about this the other day, I think it's very hard to give kind of a percentage or a number, because our event portfolios have changed so much from 2019. In terms of volume, as I said earlier, we're way up, and in terms of adding hybrid into the mix adds a completely different consideration entirely. There's going to be more requirement for more planners to plan a hybrid event. There's going to be more budget considerations. So it's very hard to kind of say what percentages might be in those different categories. What I will say though is I think virtual will stay very much part of an event planner's toolkit in the new normal, whatever that is. And it will just depend, as I said before, on the objectives of each individual event as to what format that event will take.
Got it. And I guess, Andrew, to build on that question, do you think there will be events that go back to exclusively in person? Or do you think almost all events moving forward will have some form of hybrid element? Third time lucky.
Sorry, third time lucky. Interestingly, I think we're already talking to clients where certain event types are moving completely to virtual. So I think particularly when you look at you look at that kind of learning and development space, I think is a good category for virtual, because it is primarily about information sharing, and there's quite a few many examples now where virtual, that format, that mode of delivery, works really well. And with some of the client conversations that we're having, they're saying that maybe not 100%, but 80% of their learning and development could all swing to virtual. So I think it will come down to the event types, because then you can argue the opposite for those events where that human connection, that sense of belonging, looking someone in the eye, having that handshake, in a client meeting, those cues that in-person brings to, again, going back to the objectives that you have for that meeting or that event, could lend itself much more to being delivered better in person than done virtually. But I think we've got a lot to learn, haven't we? I think that's the key. I think we're very much at the beginning of this, certainly very much the beginning of this virtual journey. I think that we were saying that the events industry has had its own Napster moment. Virtual. We're at virtual 0.1. We're not even at 1.0. We're very much at the early start of this journey. And then the more I think virtual develops, the more I think that's going to influence how hybrid develops, how we get this integration between in-person and virtual, and what the benefits that would bring over and above virtual on its own or in-person on its own. So I think we've still got a lot to learn.
Yeah, I agree. So something we've talked about a fair amount this afternoon is inclusivity and this equitable playing field, which seems to be really, really important moving forward. So we've agreed that that's it's much more inclusive in the virtual space. So what do you think we can be doing to improve in-person events or hybrid events, shall we say, to make sure that they are equally inclusive? And John, I'll come to you for that one.
Yeah, accessibility is huge. So the opportunities that we can use through technology to provide opportunities for people with any form of disability to be able to participate better, or people who maybe are not native speaking in the language that the event is taking place in. There's a massive opportunity to open the doors geographically to different languages and make people feel more comfortable or more safe participating in these events, either in person or virtually. And having the opportunities to maybe flag something when a comment is inappropriate or make somebody not feel safe, so that it can be addressed in a way that in person, people traveling, being away from home, obviously alcohol is involved and things do happen that aren't acceptable at events. And that isn't something that's easy to address in in-person experiences in the current format.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't considered that. Alex, what do you think? What do you think we can be doing to make the in-person experience that much more inclusive?
I think we've learned so much, and it would be such a shame to let it all go. I think what I found really interesting in the paper was something that translated to an experience that I've experienced within my own team. At the beginning of us working from home, I found that certain people were speaking up on calls more than others. But interestingly, it wasn't the same people who would normally speak up in a team meeting that was taking place in a meeting room. And so with the aim of being more inclusive, now where I have a topic which we as a team want to discuss, I'll send an email around beforehand. People can think about it, plan any comments they have, and submit them in advance if they wish to. So that just means we're giving all the voices the chance to be heard. And it took shamefully took working virtually to uncover that the assumption that everyone was comfortable wasn't actually true. So while this is an example outside of events per se, we can take so much, it shows that we can take so much from what we've learned about engaging virtually and apply it to all mediums going forward. And it comes back to, I know I keep repeating it, but it comes back to essentially ensuring we're giving people options on how they interact with an event and with the other attendees at that event. And we're putting them kind of at the center of how we're planning, just like we do at a virtual event. We can take that forward into our in-person planning and not just kind of going back to how we used to do things.
Absolutely. And I'm going to stick with you, Alex, on that point of in-person planning. Conscious of time, we are getting towards the end of the hour, but one big thing that comes through the white paper is sustainability and the benefits of, you know, the lesser environmental impact that virtual events have. And you mentioned statistics in there. You know, a typical person attending a virtual event, an in-person event, generates 1.89 kilograms, so nearly 2 kilograms of food waste, 49% of which goes into landfill, and 177 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions. And those are alleviated if you do the event virtually. So, Alex, how important are these sustainability considerations going to be when you are planning a return to in-person events?
So sustainability is something that's always been really high on our agenda, and it absolutely remains so. We are very lucky. We've got a fantastic team of planners across our London teams, who we affectionately call Team Green, and they're incredibly passionate about the sustainability of our events. They lead the charge, firstly on educating the rest of us and on what we can do to make our events more sustainable, but they also hold us accountable. I'll keep it short, but a great example of how they do that is they've created a post-event survey, which the planners fill out after each event, but they also use it as a guide while they're kind of planning. And it covers all sorts of aspects, from travel to which suppliers we're using and how sustainable their practices are, collateral, catering. It's a really comprehensive list, and that's just a few examples. But I think moving forward, once we have hybrid and in-person options available to us as well as virtual, certainly, you know, a big consideration to add on that list is whether the event could or should take place virtually. And, you know, I think that's going to be huge going forward. I can't think of an example where we'll be just able to justify, say, a 1-hour seminar taking place in person, you know, with the sustainability aspects. I just don't think it would be something we would very often be able to justify.
No, absolutely. That makes sense. And final question, and John, I'm going to come to you on this one. The future of technology in this space, obviously, without asking you to completely lift the lid on your roadmap, where do you think it's going?
Yeah, I think we actually addressed a lot of the points of it in this conversation already, but it's that opportunity for the always-on experience, the opportunity to integrate the audience who's participating in person with the audience who's participating virtually. I do think that it's much about having a separate track of content for each audience and perfecting it for that experience, because that experience has to be right. But the other aspects of the opportunity here from the technology perspective is really around providing better opportunities for engagement and for people to interact with each other. We talked about how at an in-person experience, you might walk by somebody, you recognize their body language, you know, maybe that person's 6'3", and you recognize them for that. Well, there's opportunities for technology to remind you when you might be crossing paths with somebody for the 7th time in the past 4 hours, and provide those opportunities to start that engagement and then rekindle that engagement a month later and bring that audience back together. So it's going to be a continued opportunity for that meshing to occur, making, you know, every aspect of the experience better. And then down the road, obviously, we'll start to see more on the augmented reality side and the virtual reality side as well. But I think what we're focused on right now is really how to create the best experience, provide the best content, differentiate what it is that we're providing to that audience, and ensure that we're doing something in a way that's creative and creating an experience that's memorable and keeping them coming back.
Got it. Well, some exciting developments coming down the line, it sounds like. guys, we're going to have to draw things to a close there. I think, safe to say we could have continued the conversation for another couple of hours, but I just want to say a huge thank you, Tamara and Diana, for joining. John, Alex, Andrew, we obviously hugely appreciate your time. We know you're very, very busy, so thank you. To those that are listening, we'll be staying true to John's recommendations. We'll be following up with content. So you're going to have a video of this, and we'll also, of course, we'll share the white paper, and I'd really recommend reading it because, like I said, it's dense with really academic research, but it's written in a very accessible way. And there's some great recommendations at the end that hopefully you guys can apply to your meetings and events programs. So thank you. Lovely to see you all. And we hope to see everyone dialing in for the next HeadBox Connect event soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.